How limited is our reality, the world in which we live? And what if there is more to reality than you understand? These are rather unsettling questions. Uh, for Plato, these unsettling questions are not just thought experiments, they are also the starting points of his philosophy of education, a call to question the depth of reality itself. And this allegory of the cave, which we've read for the first lecture in our course, The Poetics of Enchantment, provides a template for all kinds of education, experiential, spiritual, moral, for the Western world of literature and philosophy. So we're beginning with a portion of the Greek philosopher Plato's Republic, and Plato's Republic is his greatest and perhaps his most complex work. One of the central ideas introduced here is the theory of forms, and he lays this out in different discourses as well. Basically, it's the concept that reality consists of layers of which the material world is only one, and that education requires a transcendence or moving through these layers, an awareness of these layers. And I want to say that if reading Plato and if this lecture is tough for you, don't be discouraged. Philosophy is not easy. I know many of us have dealt with philosophy for a while. Some of you have been longtime readers. Julie, I know, is reading all of the Republic. But for others, this may be your first time engaging with philosophy, and it may be really difficult. And there are some abstract, complex concepts here. So I would just say, remember that some of the other works we'll be reading will call back to this, and to just hold on with what you do understand and don't worry about what you don't presently. And as the course unfolds, we're going to be coming back to this, and our understanding of Plato's Allegory of the Cave is going to dilate as these concepts become clear when we talk about some of the fiction and poetry we'll be reading in the future. So Plato is rightly considered a foundational figure in Western philosophy. He laid the groundwork for metaphysics, for ethics, which then Aristotle would take further, epistemology, political theory. His dialogues not only preserve the teachings of his mentor Socrates, who's one of the great dramatic characters of the dialogues, but they also present Plato's original ideas. Some of these dialogues, we see Plato working out theories of his own. The theory of forms, I think, is one of those. And this theory explores the relationship between the material world and the ideal, the realm of eternal truths, of concepts. His commitment to reason and this dialectical argument through the pursuit of knowledge set the standard for critical inquiry. Moreover, his influence extended through his student Aristotle. So we've got this great chain of thinkers. We might say it starts with Socrates, who's really developing Heraclitus in some ways. Socrates, then Plato. Plato establishes his academy. He teaches Aristotle. Aristotle teaches Alexander the Great. And so that's how a lot of these works are written down and then put out and read. So there's a big chunk of the intellectual heritage of the West we've read, even in just these 4 or 5 pages of the allegory. So in this lecture, I want to introduce the allegory of the cave by contextualizing it within the life and times of Plato, to talk about some of Plato's influences, and to place the allegory within this wider context of the Republic, which is the bigger work, so we can understand its relation to the course theme of enchantment. And this framework underpins Plato's theory of forms, which posits that beyond the physical world lies an eternal realm of unchanging, perfect forms or ideas that give structure and meaning to everything we experience. And that our world is an imperfect reflection of this higher reality, or at least our initial engagements with the world and how we come to understand it. So let me tell you a little bit about Plato and Socrates and their relationship. Socrates was a philosopher who was born in Athens in 469 BC and spent his life engaging in philosophical debates with sophists. He also was an Athenian soldier for some time, and he met Plato in his later life, around the early 400s BC, when Plato was a young admirer of his teachings. Here's The Death of Socrates, a really wonderful painting. This was a key moment by Jacques-Louis David. Socrates was tried and executed in 399 BC. His charges for execution were the first, impiety, and secondly, corrupting the youth. And here we have all young men, mostly young men behind him, perhaps even Plato among them here. And he was made to drink poison, and here we see a young man who was chosen to give it to him. And Socrates is has his hand out to take it, and his other hand he's pointing to the ideal realm, the transcendent. Now Plato was born around 424, 423 BC, became one of Socrates' most prominent followers. And he really wants us to know that because in both the Apology and the Phaedo, Plato mentions that he was of the intimate circle of Socrates. After Socrates' death, Plato traveled extensively. Scholars think he visited Italy, Egypt, Sicily. And then around 380, he came back to Athens to found the Academy in Athens, one of the earliest institutions of higher learning. And this is where Aristotle studied. And so Plato, the follower of Socrates, died in 348, 347 BC, leaving behind a philosophical legacy that's immortalized in the dialogues that we have. And I want to show you this beautiful mural by Raphael called The School of Athens. You've probably seen it. But this is a depiction of the Academy at Athens. Now, Plato and Aristotle both are really the architects of Western philosophy. Plato emphasized the existence of transcendent forms or ideals, and he argued that the material world is a shadow of the higher eternal reality, which is accessible through inquiry, through reason. Aristotle has different methods, and you can see in the body language here. We can recognize Plato because he's making the same gesture as Socrates as it was imagined in that 18th century painting. Here's a much earlier painting, but he's pointing up to the transcendent realms, the ideal forms, perhaps. And then Aristotle, his student, is different from Plato. The generalization is that Aristotle focused on empirical observation. He was interested in how knowledge arises from studying the natural world, the forms that exist in objects, not in this separate transcendental realm. So while Plato speculated metaphysically, Aristotle grounded his philosophy in the physical sciences, excuse me, and logical analysis, which Plato employs as well. But he's much more interested in studying knowledge and learning through a study of the natural world. And you can see he's got his hand gestured outward, and he's holding his ethics. And it looks like Plato is holding his Timaeus, which also talks about the theory of forms. So the death of Socrates deeply influenced Plato, and it got him thinking about the role of philosophy and the state. Plato, along with others of that inner circle of Socrates, started writing fictional dialogues, perhaps even some that were recorded from memory of actual conversations with Socrates. These dialogues were, on one hand, preservative. It meant to keep hold of what Socrates had given the men and to give it to others as well. meant to depict his character and his personality. On the other hand, they were models of philosophical inquiry that carried the distinctive themes of Socratic dialogue. Aristotle calls them Socraticoi logoi, the Socratic dialogues or conversations. Logos means conversation. We'll see next week. Word, argument, could be song even, and logoi is the plural of that. So this was a really formative and innovative way of exploring philosophy, where you have the sophists who were manipulating logic, and you had rhetoricians who were manipulating a very one-sided delivery of a treatise or a philosophy, trying to persuade. Well, you had those forms of discourse. On the margin, you had Plato and possibly even Aris and Socrates, who, instead of giving us a treatise, a speech, or a really sophisticated uh, logical analysis, gives us a conversation. I think that's really important. He wants to show, I think, that his interlocutor, who in this case, Glaucon, is following along by the assent of his will. He's not being manipulated by the sophist. He's not really even being persuaded or engaged with his emotions by the rhetoricians. This is a logical assent of the will. I think that's what the dialogues are giving us here. But this is a way for the young men to carry forward what they felt was important. All of them, including Plato, would have been deeply disturbed, if not traumatized, by the event of Socrates' death. And there's something in this story which is reminiscent of Prometheus, who was punished for bringing fire to humankind. And even in some contemporary narratives, you look at the movie Dead Poets Society as maybe a different sort of reenactment of this story of Socrates being condemned for corrupting the youth. And there are elements of this even in the allegory of the cave, as we'll soon see. Now I want to zero in on the Republic and give you a little context for that. For Plato, the execution of Socrates revealed to him that there was an ugly dissonance between philosophy and the politics of Athens. There, very clearly, from that moment on, it was clear that the state had different priorities and that the philosophers had a different set of goals and assumptions. And that, I think, is the impetus behind his Republic. It's a work of political philosophy, yes, but it's also regarded as a work of utopian fiction, a treatise on ideal education. In fact, he speaks just as much about the individual, I think even more about the individual than he does about the state. And the two are necessarily related in Plato's thought. Let me give you an example. He talks about the ideal city as being structured into three classes: producers, auxiliaries, and guardians, each with a distinct role. Producers, they satisfy the material needs. Auxiliaries provide defense. Guardians govern, they rule. And each class operates within its specific function, and they avoid interference with each other, ideally. That's how Plato lays it out. They stay in their own lanes, they don't bother with each other. The city is envisioned as really orderly, harmonious, unified, and the rulers and auxiliaries are focused on safeguarding the state's overall welfare. Now, the three classes of the states correspond to the three-part division of the soul that Plato outlines. He divides the soul into reason, spirit, appetite. So we have the producers who are satisfying the body, the appetite. We have the auxiliaries, safeguarding reason. If you're focused with war and defense, countries have a difficult time devoting a lot of time to philosophy and speculation, such as the ideal realm. And so you need that state in order to have a robust intellectual life in that state. And then the spirit, ruled by the governors, the guardians. But justice for Plato's Socrates, and I do refer to Socrates here as Plato's Socrates because in a way it's Plato's fiction of a real character in the dialogues. So justice for Plato's Socrates is not exclusively a legal concept the way we would think about it. It involves, it's actually much broader. It involves a functional harmony. Justice for Plato is when each part functions properly without getting in the way of the other parts. On the state level, this means that all things are governed well. On an individual level, this means that there's a psychological harmony between the body and the mind. This is an idea of harmony. So that's the general idea, I think, behind Plato's Republic on the whole. And this is important because in the context of the whole book, the allegory of the cave addresses a central problem. It addresses this challenge that how do you acquire knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? Acquiring the knowledge is necessary for the rulers if they're going to exercise justice. They must grasp not the particulars of exercising justice, how to exercise it in these different scenarios, but the ideal form of justice. What is the idea of justice? The universal idea of justice. If a state's going to be just, it has to have rulers that are acquainted with this ideal form of justice, and then they can apply it. So without this knowledge, it's impossible to comprehend what makes actions or states just. So the dialogue comes to a standstill at book 7. And Socrates says, for us to go on, we have to figure out, we have to establish where knowledge comes from before we can do anything else. And that's what this allegory is about. Philosopher rulers must also understand all the forms. The form of justice, yes. The form of beauty, the form of the good. And Book 7 highlights the immense difficulty of apprehending the forms because that's where true knowledge lies. So let's take a look at the allegory. Hello, everyone. If you're enjoying this lecture and you'd like to join the live classrooms and the discussions, then you can sign up to study literature with me at Versed, an online community where readers study poetry and take classes together. It's inspired by the university lecture hall and discussion model, and this is where I host my live courses, my live lectures, book clubs, seminar discussions, and more, all with an open door policy. No pressure, no cold calls, and no snobbery. Just serious people who love literature in a friendly space. Every few months or so, we vote on our next courses and reading groups, so as a member, you can help us decide what we'll read next. And when you do join, you'll get access to the live discussions that are happening now, all the past courses, all the discussion rooms, the chat rooms, the special Q&A sessions that I sometimes host, and the office hours with me, where you can talk about your latest readings. You'll even find space to share some of your own poetry if you're a poet yourself, a place where you can workshop poetry with other poets who practice the craft. It's a great place to find community with other readers and other poets. So if you'd like to join us, check out the link below. And now, back to the lecture. The Allegory of the Cave, as you have read, presents an unusual scenario. Prisoners are confined to a cave. They mistake shadows on the wall for the things themselves. And we have a nice engraving here, looks like, of this depiction. Here we have the people. They look pretty free to move about. I don't see any chains here. This isn't exactly a literal representation of the allegory, but they're there and they're looking at the shadows. Their vision in Plato's allegory is restricted to the wall. They can only see the wall, where shadows of objects pass by and cast a fire behind them. These shadows are the only reality the prisoners know. This condition, he says, symbolizes the initial state of human ignorance and the constraints imposed by limited knowledge and perception. We remember they're all very proud of identifying the shadows, and the ones who are best at identifying the shadows are called philosophers. Socrates explains when he explains the parable to Glaucon. He says, the realm revealed by sight corresponds to the prison, and the light of the fire to the power of the sun. We have these correspondences. So he imagines a scenario in which one of these prisoners is freed and begins to move around the cave, and he adjusts to the light of the fire, turning to see the objects casting the shadows. He realizes, has this epiphany, that what he once believed to be objects are really just shadows of objects, a distorted projection. And this realization marks the critical shift as the freed prisoner begins to question the nature of existence and even the sources of his prior belief. Everything has to be rewritten from here after this moment. This transition is difficult and fraught with resistance because there's so much in the mind that is reluctant to let go of past forms of knowledge. What really facilitates a dilation of knowledge is having something else to grasp onto to replace what was old. You can't just show the man that these are shadows, everything you believed was fake. You have to also show what reality is. Socrates explains, uh, and you won't go wrong if you connect the ascent into the upper world and the sight of the objects there with the upward progress of the mind to the intelligible region. That, at any rate, is my interpretation, which is what you are anxious to hear. The truth of the matter is, after all, known only to God. And I find it interesting that the writer of this allegory um, considers that his own interpretation on it might not be the whole story, and there might be a little humor going on here. But I think that's also how the Western tradition afterwards has treated this allegory by doing different things with it and saying it means different things. It's not completely restricted to Socrates' explanation of it. So you see the light, there's the fire there, he's looking up. He looks really interested, this guy here. He's not too frightened. And then we have the exit of the cave, where we have the three figures out looking at the sun. And this moves us to the third stage, when the prisoner is, in the allegory, forcibly drawn out of the cave and into the world beyond. And it's there, beyond the cave walls, that he encounters the brilliance of the sun, which initially blinds him. There's a lot of uh, harm happening in this process, a lot of, we think, anxiety. Gradually, the prisoner perceives the true forms and the sun as the ultimate source of life and knowledge. And then this, of course, represents the realization of higher truths. Socrates gives his explanation. But in my opinion, for what it's worth, the final thing to be perceived in the intelligent region, and perceived only with difficulty, is the form of the good. Once seen, it is inferred to be responsible for whatever is right and valuable in anything, producing in the visible region light and the source of light, and being in the intelligible region itself, controlling source of truth and intelligence. And anyone who is going to act rationally, either in public or private, must have sight of it. And here's why the allegory is so central to the Republic. You have to get at these original ideas. The philosophers, the people in power, are going to have to see truth. They shouldn't be the ones manipulating the forms or the shadows on the wall to their advantage. They should be going back and bringing others up as well. This is the theory of forms. And Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, mentions that in his youth, Plato had become familiar, first of all, with Cratylus, and with the Heraclitean views of flux. So Heraclitus, I think, is the key name here. All things are in flux. Plato and Aristotle described Heraclitus, he's a pre-Socratic, we would call. He holds views that Plato regarded as contradictory. Plato thought that Heraclitus asserted, one, that there's this perpetual change in all things. Everything is in flux. Secondly, there's the equivalence of opposites, which leads to the idea that everything exists and doesn't exist at the same time. And so this is a bit of a contradiction. And so Plato, some scholars believe, is setting out to fix the contradiction in Heraclitus's theory that he possibly admired. So he's kind of cleaning up this discrepancy, perhaps, making the eternal logos transcendent above the flux and change. So there is flux and change. That's a condition of the material world, but there is this unchanging idea, set of ideas, arrangement of forms. And the forms are the objects of the true knowledge, which Plato distinguishes from opinion. And these forms are achieved through rational inquiry. It's interesting that throughout this entire process, there's not a single person really moving about alone. Somebody's either forcibly dragging or, in the case of this picture, pointing, indicating. It's sort of this communal template of education. I think this is central to Plato's ideal republic. But then there's the fourth and final stage, and that's the return. The return to the cave. You've got this ethical, moral, really a moral burden to return and share what you've learned. The enlightened prisoner goes back, having experienced the light of the sun and understood the true nature of reality. Let's see. There we are. Here he is, reasoning with them. The prisoner feels compelled to go back. The return is also fraught with difficulties. Re-entering the darkness of the cave, the freed individual's eyes must adjust again to the darkness, and the clarity of vision achieved is the outer world, in the outer world is temporarily obscured. And this adjustment parallels the challenge of translating insights, knowledge, into terms that those in the cave can understand. The prisoners who remain, they look kind of amused, kind of skeptical even. They perceive this fellow as perhaps crazy. They're skeptical of his claims. Perhaps this man is deluded. And in some versions of the allegory's interpretation, this skepticism escalates to hostility as the prisoners resist any challenge to their established beliefs and comfort in their shadow world. This is the final struggle of the philosophers and visionaries who attempt to bring the new ideas or transformative truths into a society unprepared or unwilling to embrace them. And the allegory underscores this inherent tension between enlightenment and ignorance and highlights the courage required to confront this resistance. And that's, I think, is where we get the idea of Socrates here, and the trial of Socrates. Let's see, there it is. Nor will you think it strange, explains Socrates, that anyone who descends from contemplation of the divine to a human life and its ills should blunder and make a fool of himself, if while still blinded and unaccustomed to the surrounding darkness, he's forcibly put on trial in the law courts or elsewhere about the shadows of justice, or the figures of which they are shadows, and made to dispute about notions of them held by men who have never seen justice itself. And I think this is really where we see um, the trial of Socrates reflected here. This is all concerned with education. For Plato, the sun symbolizes the ultimate form of truth, the good, and the cave represents the limited understanding. But the narrative arc is very similar to Joseph Campbell's monomyth, this idea of the hero's journey. Here we're beginning both of these courses, the Bible and poetry, and the poetics of enchantment with Campbell, I think, because there's a lot of connection here in the early literature with myth. And I think even Plato's allegory taps into that. You know the pattern. It's almost every great story. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, name any great story, and it follows roughly this pattern. Yeah, this is Campbell's monomyth. The hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. So here are the trials of education. Then the hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons to his fellow man. And I'm reading from the 1949 The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Campbell. This is from page 30. He just summarizes it. And so you've got this pattern working out in so many stories that we're going to be reading, from the Arthurian legends to some of the theological treatises we'll be reading, some of the poems, some of the novels. They all generally follow this pattern. Now, uh, to conclude, let me talk about some afterlives here, just so you're aware of where this theory of the forms goes. The There's the Christian tradition, which comes much later, and then there's the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions that are formed uh, afterward, possibly, and even in parallel with the Christian traditions for a while. And then there's some overlap too. That's really interesting. So one of the afterlives in pre-Christian philosophy is this commitment to immanent principles. So some future philosophers of the Platonist school unified around the view that the world is intelligible only through immaterial principles, including forms, which transcend material reality. And this commitment, paired with the belief in Plato's philosophical infallibility, laid the foundation for these Platonists' metaphysical explorations. So we see in the Gospel of St. John, which we'll read next week, that John addresses some of his Greek readers when he introduces the Logos in his prologue. They are Greek readers who are educated. And you see Paul doing this in the book of Acts when he goes to preach to the Greeks. He borrows from their vocabulary. So that's some intersection to look out for in the future. There's also the metaphysical developments, which are really rich. David was giving us a great survey of the afterlife here in Neo-Platonism. Figures like Plotinus expanded the theory of forms and situated it within this hierarchy of principles. There's the one or the good, which is the apex, the ultimate source of truth. Then you have the intellect, which contains the forms as its thoughts. And then you have the soul, which is like the mediator. It mediates between these higher principles of the material and the material world. So you've got the higher principles, the material world, you got the soul in between. So Plotinus emphasizes the unity of the intellect and the forms. The forms become kind of the mind of God, essentially. You can see how this is really attractive to the Christian traditions. So the other is epistemological refinements. Epistemology is the study of what is known. How can we know what we know? And it's a discipline that this allegory is really concerned with. There are early Platonists, middle Platonists, late Platonists. One of the middle Platonists, like Alcinous, endorsed this dualistic separation of the perceptual and the intellectual cognition. And so some will take this philosophy and go in one direction and say the material and the spiritual are two separate realms. There are no overlaps. One is good, one is evil. There are many ways you can take Platonic thought in the theory of forms. Plotinus did not like this view. He critiqued this view, and he argued for the soul's constant engagement with the forms because the mediating soul has access to it through innate concepts. There's this continuous and direct process. I think this is more true to Plato's theory of the allegory because within everybody there, chained within the cave, is this ability to be educated. And it's also a little more democratic. And then there's the integration of this thought with other traditions. Neoplatonists absorbed ideas from Aristotle and from the Stoic traditions and fused it with Plotinus. Plotinus himself integrated Aristotelian concepts of the active intellect with Platonic metaphysics. There's also this expansion in spiritual dimensions with the Neoplatonists. You have Iamblichus, who introduced a new metaphysical construct of the unparticipated principles. Uh, he talks about theurgy, the ritual practices intended to unite the soul with the higher principles. So there was a form of a ritual in order to get the soul into that form. And this was a kind of mysticism that accompanied the intellectual inquiry. But Platonism evolved also and informed a Hermetic tradition, which, with a structured curriculum. Later figures like Proclus codified complex metaphysical systems that would influence Christian, Islamic, various forms of medieval scholasticism by embedding this theory of forms within other theological frameworks. There's so much that's been done with it. Something that's important to us in this course is the afterlife of this in Christian theology and what the Christians did with it. And they all did different things with it. Aquinas's engagement with Plato is very different from Origenes' engagement. Julian of Norwich, the Platonism implied in some passages, very different from uh, Spencer's Platonic influences. But you can see how so much of this is being used and taken up. So Plato's forms are presented as the stable, unchanging realities that underlie the mutable, transient physical world. This perspective in the Christian thought meant that divine ideas serve as eternal, immutable truths within the mind of God. So for thinkers like Augustine, he integrated the concept of Platonic forms by locating them within God's mind, particularly in the Word or the Logos, which we'll read about in St. John's Gospel. They were exemplar ideas, as Augustine said, not separate from God, but are intrinsic to God's eternal act of self-knowing. So it's, it's it's all about the circulating energies of the Trinity. So then into Christian thought, uh, this Platonic theory of the forms involved a kind of reinterpretation, an actual reinterpretation. While Plato situated forms as abstract entities separate from the physical world, Christian theologians took this and saw these forms as actual expressions of God's infinite knowing, infinite loving, infinite sharing, and that the divine ideas thus became a way to understand the relationship between creation and the creator, with creatures reflecting divine archetypes. In the Neoplatonic, you can see how that mirrors Plotinus's idea of the mediating soul in a way, um, which is just fascinating. So you can see what they did with it, how they made use of it. And I think as we go on and read what we have on the reading list, we'll see just how important this theory of forms is. So Plato's allegory of the cave remains one of the best tropes for the figure of enlightenment, the journey to enlightenment, and the transformative power of education. Almost all of the fictional heroes and heroines in our future stories undergo a similar path, and that's going to harken back a little bit to the monomyth. In fact, it's very similar to, um, the hero's journey, which is slightly reductionist. We saw that template, but it's no doubt really compelling and fits a lot of stories. So from its origins in ancient Greece, through its Christian reinterpretation of the forms as divine ideas, I think this allegory is speaking to really a basis of how do we understand reality beyond mere appearances. And it reminds us that true knowledge requires both the courage to question our assumptions and the compassion to guide others along our paths of inquiry. I think dialogue, too, is beautifully modeled in some of Plato's work. We were talking on the Discord of how it's really annoying how Glaucon just simply agrees with Plato. Oh, yes, Plato. So it must be, Plato. You know best, Plato. And it's like, this guy really doesn't have his own thoughts. But in other dialogues, in the Apology, in the Symposium, there's more back and forth. In the Symposium, Socrates is actually beat at his own game by Diotima, and it's actually really enjoyable. So I think this dialogue is something that's really important to the philosophical inquiry that we're embarking on. And the cave reveals how the philosophical pursuit of truth, excuse me, contains this element of wonder and transformation. And I think it's in line with Plato. I think he would agree that all education involves some sense of wonder or enchantment. It's pretty key to education, I think. So we're going to remember this allegory in our future readings throughout the course. And I think even in the conversations in our community, we'll probably just keep circling back to it.